Hi, I'm Dianetics. I'm extraordinarily pleased to welcome a new guest, Gerette Buglion, who is the author of a wonderful new book called An Everyday Cult. And I'm not sure how many books I've read about cults, too many over the last 40 years. But this really stands out because it's clear, it's well written, and it has that main aspect, which is it's easy to read. You skip from one page to the next going through, and it does tell a quintessential story, the story that almost anybody who's been involved in an authoritarian group has experienced. So why don't you open up by telling us a little bit about the group you were involved in, and how long for, and what it did to you along the way. And I'll interject if you'll forgive me.
For sure. My gosh, thank you so much for that introduction. And I am so grateful that you took the time to read my book, John. And, you already mentioned the title, which is An Everyday Cult, which is to me also a descriptor of the kind of group that I was in. Since I left the group 7.5 years ago, I have immersed myself in cultic studies, and I know that the wide range of groups. And so for me, this concept of an everyday cult is one in which it's not as easy to identify as some cultic groups. We don't go around wearing, certain colors clothing, or
orange.
Or no orange. We don't have to have our hair long or wear skirts, or even the more subtle things like a little certain kind of necklace.
Or a little red braid around your wrist.
Right. There's nothing that we didn't have anything like that. Everybody who was in the group that I was involved in had very active careers. They worked out in the world, and we would come together. What joined us was our fearless leader, of course. His name is Doug. And
for purposes of the book.
Yes, for purposes of the book. Yep. And what's funny is now I even think of him as Doug. Yes. I don't use his name in my book, just to, really to avoid any potential litigation. And also because the group that I was in was so small, so kind of podunky, that to have potential litigation would actually be a distraction from the work that I'm so passionate about right now.
It can certainly be a distraction. You're talking to somebody who's been sued many times, and it's very distracting.
So hopefully, John, I get to avoid what you have been through.
I hope
so.
But
I was tied to that teacher, at first kind of loosely so, for the first 5 years, but then that became increasingly my mental space, and connection to him became stronger and stronger. But for a total of 18 years. So from when my daughter was 6 months old until she was 18.
Until she attained her majority.
Exactly. No. Yeah.
Okay, and what about looking at your book, and let me show you. I've got lots of little yellow tabs.
Oh my goodness! Oh, I can't wait to hear your questions.
Well, a lot of them. Looking at it, I'm a compulsive annotator because a large part. I'm a writer. A large part of my work has been editing and proofing as well. So I just do it. It keeps me sharp, and it did prove very useful once. I was asked in a court case to show that a group that was being accused of plagiarizing Ron Hubbard's work. I was able to show that Hubbard had plagiarized everything, but it didn't take me very long. As long as I could remember which books to look at, The notes were already there. And so in about 7 or 8 hours, I wrote a paper that's called Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology. One of my snappier titles, I like to think, which is on the internet for anybody who cares to indulge. But it seems to me, Doug is basically somebody who has taken a lot of ideas from Jung. He's going to interpret dreams, which I think is a completely bogus form of psychotherapy. Personally, I think very occasionally we have a meaningful dream, but I think for the most part it is. There's a great book by Professor Matthew Walker at Berkeley called Why We Sleep, which does actually update us on what's happening in the different phases of sleep. And we dream for at least 70% of the time we're asleep, and we remember about that much of it, you know,
a little snippet, right?
Yeah, which is only because we came towards wakefulness at the point where we were dreaming it. So the idea that, you know, there's some sort of divine being inside us manipulating us. But he put forward Jung's idea of an indwelling animus, this invisible creature that is governing your life. And one of the things I really liked, and there are a lot of things I really liked, make a statement, and I'm going to have to put my spectacles on for this.
Sure.
Say, breaking out of dualistic good and bad thinking allows my nervous system, my entire being to relax, welcoming nuance and the beauty of simply being human. I awaken to a new concept. I don't have enemies within me.
Right.
And this is a failing in religion, in therapy,
right.
all over the place. You've got this invisible Mr. Hyde who is messing with you all the time. And it isn't true. There is no unconscious mind. There's no agency. There are unconscious processes within the mind.
Yes. And not only that, John, that this concept of an inner enemy is just the perfect hook for nefarious religious leaders or you know, dream interpreters or whatever, you know, whatever kind of, you know, business group, for any kind of a you know, a nefarious leader to just sprinkle in this idea that something inside of you can't be trusted and it needs fixing. That was laid out, and that's something that I, you know, share in my book. From the very first time I sat with Doug across from his big oak desk, his big oak desk, you know, that idea was, that hook was laid.
And I mean, you talk about, you know, the uncertainties you have about yourself, the anxieties you have about yourself. It's a commonplace for intelligent people to feel that they're imposters, imposter syndrome, this idea that they don't deserve the things that have come to them. That's an aspect, I think, of any, you know, normal, reasonable human being, that we doubt ourselves. And if you don't, then you're in that small collection of, I call them human predators, covering the whole ground, psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians, what have you. That if you don't have self-doubt, then there's definitely something badly wrong with you. But if you do have self-doubt, somebody can convince you that there's something much more wrong with you and that they can take over and manipulate that. And so am I right in thinking about every 2 weeks you would go and have a personal session with Doug?
Yes, every 2 weeks, religiously. It was my religion. It became not only my anchor in my, you know, daily regular life, these every 2 week sessions with Doug, it was also my husband's. So we made a commitment early on, after we each had our first session. We were both like, oh, this is so important. We're going to make this a priority. And, you know, in part because we both had friends who were seeing Doug, and they loved it. They were growing, and there were really wonderful aspects of it, particularly in the beginning. Because of course, I'm not sure what you would say about this with Scientology, but from the perspective of what I call an everyday cult, there's always something good.
Yeah.
That there were positive things happening, in my friends that were truly bringing them greater levity and self-awareness and joy and perspective that was truly helpful. So there were things that were helpful. And, that, and the fact that both of us, my husband and I found something that we wanted to do together.
Yeah.
That was beautiful. Like it really was. It gave us a language. It gave us something, kind of a reference point from which we could grow in our individual selves and also as a couple. It was perfect, just perfect.
I think, there's a talk on my channel with Christian Sherko, who is one of the most remarkable recovery counselors in the history of recovery. He's talked with literally thousands of people over the years, and he's probably my closest friend. I've known him for what is it, it'd be 35 years this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. I will look forward to seeing that one.
But he wanted to talk about this thing which he and I have both seen, which is this kind of the polarized thinking, the black and white thinking that is engendered by authoritarian groups. When you leave, it's a very good idea to say, well, this was beneficial to me, this was detrimental to me, and to get that balance. Partly, if you've been in the foxholes with somebody, that of itself can be a powerful experience, a communion building experience. Right. And in any group, I've often, Scientology hasn't been my central topic for many years. In the 90s, I was looking at terrorism particularly. And you find this same sense of camaraderie, this sense of community, motivation, purpose, which will be in any group that you feel you're moving forward. But and then there will be realizations. Before I got involved with Scientology, I used to have realizations on a regular basis. After I got into Scientology, it kind of slowed down, frankly, because what you're meant to realize is that whatever the leader says is true. And in Scientology, the catch-22 is you will become completely self-determined as soon as you do exactly what I say. You'll be able to think for yourself when you agree with me.
Right.
Which is a tendency that is an authoritarian tendency. You don't mention it in the book, and you may not want to mention it, but how much did it actually cost to see Doug, and how much time would you spend with him in these 2 weekly sessions?
Yeah, great question. When I first started, it was, we pay, I don't know, he actually had kind of I think he called it a discount rate or a sliding scale kind of thing.
Buy now.
Exactly. And I think it was, if I recall correctly, it was like $35 for an hour session. And, and at the time, $35 was a good chunk of money, but it wasn't too painful. By the time I left, he had shifted to, for the experienced and the people who were committed to CTL, the organization that grew out of the work, we could opt for a half-hour session for $100. So that's a little bit of in the 18 years, that's just a little bit more than inflation, don't you think?
It is. And were those initial sessions half an hour, or were they a bit longer?
The initial sessions were an hour.
Yeah. So
it was only in the last 2 years that a half-hour session was. It was kind of like it was actually kind of the way it was presented was as if only the people who were really committed would qualify, could have the option of a half hour. It was actually, it was a prestige, a sign of prestige, but we were also just putting that much more in his pocket. But the sessions were only one part of the cost.
Yeah.
Because in addition to that, there were many, many classes. So each class, would be, I don't remember the cost for the classes, but they were expensive. But then more expensive than all were the retreats. And when you committed to being part of the organization, the Center for Transformational Learning is what I call it. When you committed to be a member there, you actually were committing to at least 2 retreats a year that were, local, and 1 away retreat. So that was when we left, our kind of home base in northeastern United States. That's where we were located.
So, I mean, the inflation, the cost went up 6 times over, from $35 to $200 an hour. $35 a half hour to, $35 an hour to $100 a half hour. So about 6 times over. On top of that, you'd have retreats. So 2 of those a year, and the cost to do those, you'd fundamentally be spending $5,000-6,000 a year quite easily.
Yeah, each of us, my husband and I were, we actually were looking at, 10 to 15,000 a year, because there would also be travel in there. We would also have childcare costs. When we were both away, we had to pay for people to be with our children. It was we didn't make a whole lot of money. It was a very significant chunk of our income.
Yes, yeah, which it will generally be. I mean, when I got involved with Scientology many a long year ago, in 1974, the hourly price of counseling, as it was called, was £6. By the time I left 9 years later, it was £120. So we managed to inflate much more.
Okay, right.
Would now cost, I estimate, about $500,000 to do all of the steps of the so-called bridge of Scientology. So, in 9 years, I spent about £1,000 a year during that time. But nonetheless, it's a part of what's going on. And it also, of course, the more you pay for things, the more committed you are to them. Psychology has shown this. That
sunken cost fallacy, huh?
Sunken cost fallacy, exactly. Right. Which is where you will throw good money after bad and keep paying, because although you haven't got the results that were promised to you, you're sure you will.
Absolutely. It's coming just around the next retreat. It's going to happen at the next retreat, finally.
And then you have those periods of bliss, those moments which seem to be supreme realization, where you've made, a connection with all of humanity, and you feel compassionate and wonderful and loved up. Much cheaper to take drugs and probably less dangerous.
I know, for sure. So you're advocating drug usage, huh, John?
Well, I've just read a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups by a Columbia professor, Ivy League professor, called Carl Hart. And that's what he's saying. He's saying he enjoys heroin, which is, although Scientology says that I was a heroin addict, I've never actually seen heroin, let alone taken it. I think it's what I saw was with Scientology and with many other groups, you have a kind of junkie relationship to them, where you've got to get more, and it becomes very much the same as taking drugs. I think dependence of that type on anything is bad, and there are some drugs I advocate and some I don't. I'm not very keen, for example, on caffeine. I think that's quite dangerous.
Sugar
can be horrible, dreadful. Right. But that dependency becomes extremely important, that it becomes your Weltanschauung, your paradigm, your worldview fits into this thing.
Yeah.
And in coming away from it, for me, that it was incredible. I mean, you know, you get the honeymoon period when you join a group, and then you get the marriage period as it gets a bit more difficult, and then you have the divorce. And after the divorce, for me, I just felt an incredible liberation that I no longer had to constrain my thoughts to fit with what somebody else thought, and so I could choose what to think, and that
liberation, absolute freedom. Yeah.
And unfortunately, many people don't experience that. Many people will be thrown out or walk away, and just kind of go, I'm not going to talk about it anymore.
Right.
And I think that brings us to something else that you've been very involved with, which is the I Got Out movement, which is to authoritarian groups what Me Too is to sexual harassment, and where people, without having to name themselves, without having to name their group or the leader, can talk about their experience, which is a part of how we free ourselves from past experience. I think just walking away and going, I'm never going to think about it again, so I will repress it, I don't need any unconscious process. I think that can be quite dangerous. And I have met people who 10 or 20 years later really regretted that they didn't think it through at the time, because it's not as dangerous as you think generally to think about things. You know, they aren't actually there anymore, and they can't bite you anymore. They're just the ideas that there's a residue of that.
Well, and so much stigma too. You know, that the societal stigma about, you know, having been involved in a weird group, or, you know, like, I think that, and the shame, I think, you know, the shame, like when we realize that we've been involved in something that was actually not what we thought it was. Or like you mentioned, and I think it's a really important point, John, people who are pushed out, people who are shunned from the group. That's a very different experience to be out in the world when you've been pushed away. And I think that... Let me
interject and comment on that. I was on a plane to Chicago many years ago, and there was a man came in and sat next to me, and he looked very serious indeed. And he'd got a little copy of the Gospels and a huge Bible concordance. So I knew I was dealing with something that was a bit odd. It turned out he was 38 years old. At the age of 16, he'd been thrown out of the Watchtower Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he had spent 22 years trying to get back in, not being allowed to see his family. And as I say, he was really somber, you know, and I was glad that at least at the end of 2 hours of conversation with him, he was smiling, which is something I don't think he'd done all that much before. So yes, it can have a terrible effect, because the demand for purity in such a group, as Robert J. Lifton says, means that if I'm not fulfilling those standards, he truly believed he was an evil person, because at the age of 16, you know, he'd smoked a marijuana spliff or something, and therefore betrayed God and his family. And to have that oppressive weight put upon you is a dreadful thing. So, and of course, worse yet for people like him who are born-ins, second generation members, this kind of love of SGMs, initialization, but born-ins. If you grew up with that value system and no other value system, and certainly with ex-Scientologists, I've dealt with a few who this happened to, and you need something else to compare things to, because decades later, I have a good friend who she'd been out for nearly 20 years when I met her, and she'd done a medical degree. You know, she'd not lived among Scientologists, but she was still saying, oh, when Ron Hubbard says that reality is an agreement, is that true? And it's sort of, well, yeah, if you're the hypnotist, absolutely it's true. Everybody believes what you believe.
Oh,
But
right.
otherwise, no, reality is what we determine it is as individuals. And it was great because a week later, when I talked with her again, she's down in Australia, and she said she'd used scented laundry conditioner, fabric conditioner in her wash. And we both knew what she meant. We hadn't talked about this at all. But this is a little petty rule that Hubbard has only for the people who work for him, called the hygiene rule, which is you cannot have scent in anything, shampoo, soap, anything. And she'd broken the rule. And it meant that process of being able to be naughty, being able to check these rules.
Yeah.
And actually, often when people leave, they're kind of 12 years old again, and they have to go through adolescence and come back again and check things. With me, a lot of my friends grew beards and smoked dope. It's like,
right, of course.
These were forbidden. Dope was definitely forbidden. Though it didn't stop Hubbard from exploring just about every drug known to man, frankly. But one rule for the guru and another for the...
Yes, exactly. Totally different. Yeah, so I think that, the perspective of the stigma and the oppression that people experience once they come out, John, when people don't have the opportunity to share their story, there's a way that I think we can become frozen in time, even though, like you described your friend who went off and got a doctorate degree, there was some part of her that still was frozen in time and not not using scented laundry detergent. And it's I feel so grateful to a friend of mine when I got out, who introduced me to the work of Dr. Dan Siegel. So right away, I learned about creating a coherent narrative as an important way of processing trauma. So I learned, right off, and I tell you, this probably helped me more than anything else. I learned that I needed to speak about my experience. I learned that I needed to write about my experience. And I did both of those things a lot. I started writing and I talked. I didn't hold back. I mean, I did use some discernment, of course, because I had given up discernment being in the group.
Yes.
But I really believe that those two things were very important. And in the hashtag I got out movement, we can call it a movement now because it is starting to, really, thousands of people are using the hashtag and sharing their stories. And there's this extraordinary thing that's happening, and that people are they're reading each other's stories and comparing notes and finding this extraordinary level of resonance, even if you can't be public. Because some people, it's not safe. No. It's not safe emotionally, or like literally they could be in danger to share their story, because there could be the cultic group could come after them in some situations, more extreme, literally for their lives or for their livelihood, or threaten them in one way or another. But what we're finding is that all people can share their story anonymously. And this kind of sharing of the story is helping to just bring it more out into the world. It's the stories that are educating the public, that are educating the people who are, and we have people that come to the website. Most of them are definitely cult survivors. But John, it's so interesting. More and more now, we're actually finding people who have found the IGotOut.org website are not cult survivors. You know, I mean, I think we'll always have most cult survivors, but more of them, some of them now are people who are interested in this phenomenon and wanting
we
to
saw this
learn.
at the underground, Tony Ortega's underground bunker, which is a wonderful site that Tony, I wrote there through 2013 through to 2015. And it was remarkable that perhaps as many as half of the people going through there, again, people who called never-ins, people who had not had an experience within an authoritarian cult group. There is also, of course, the thing that we've all had some experience of being sold something we didn't want. All of us.
Absolutely.
Unless we're the salespeople who've done the selling. But and that, as you know, we're realizing for anybody, you know, when I was in Scientology, I knew the Moonies and the Krishnas were cults. And but I, you know, I wasn't in a cult. And that being able to put the label there, which I'm careful about, I'm talking about authoritarian cults. I'm not talking about, you know, the word cult means a devotion to a dogma, a doctrine, or a leader. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
You know? Christianity is the cult of Jesus, that, you know, technically and practically.
Yeah.
And that can become, it's whether it's a malignant or destructive cult. I put in authoritarian because for me, that's the value where we don't have choice. That's the thing that's wrong in our society, not that there are these little specialized groups that they're all dress up in white and have little bats and hit red balls between wickets and things like that. That's not really, it can be a problem, obviously, if you get hit by a cricket ball, but it's not the significant problem. It becomes a problem when the worst of problems, when you take a set of convictions and you then add to them the dispensing of existence, the willingness to kill others. So in looking at, I've done a lot of work looking at radicalization. And it's very surprising when you see the ISIS handbook, Al-Qaeda's handbook, how they recruit people, and they do use a written manual, which is available. It's very similar to the manuals used by the Moonies, by Scientology, or indeed by any second-hand car salesman, that there are certain vulnerabilities that we have. And so by talking about these things, we alert people to quite normal human dynamics, things that are happening all the time. As Margaret Singer said, you know, she talked about Cults in Our Midst, a fine book that she wrote with Janja Lalich. And I remember talking to Margaret and her saying, you know, the title is there because I believe our society is a set of interlocking cults. And, you know, it's then a matter of how we withdraw the authoritarianism from that, how we create a consensus society where people are allowed to express themselves and different viewpoints can be heard, which is, you know, unfortunately, even in democracy, we seem to vote in people who are dictators, people who are bullies, and there are a plethora of them around the world at the moment, sadly.
I think, John, if more of us, and I do think this is starting to happen, but if the more that we as a society, you know, that we have the opportunities to come to really understand how influence works, the better off we will be.
For sure.
And if we look at that link between, you know, the snake oil salesman and how we've all been hoodwinked, we've all been schnookered, you know, one way or another. And if we can look with honesty, and not only honesty, but also just with open eyes at how influence works. I've recently, and I don't know why it took me so long to find this book, but I am so grateful for the work of Robert Cialdini.
Of course.
The book Influence, Science and Practice.
And his next book, Persuasion, which adds to it. Excellent, excellent work. Yeah,
really,
I mean, I encountered it 30 years ago, and I've had, you know, some slight correspondence with Bob Cialdini was on the board of the Open Minds Foundation when I was there, And there, Anthony Prakarnis is another of the, he edits Influence magazine, and the book he co-authored, Age of Propaganda. That alongside Influence are two of the probably five, along with Jan Jeledic's Take Back Your Life, Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control. There's a little clutch of books that
are gold.
You can spend, I play the drums. I've played the drums since I was 15, which is 50 years. And it took me about 20 years to learn certain basics, which had I had a teacher, and I played professionally, but nonetheless, had I been willing to just sit down and learn, I could have absorbed this a great deal faster. What I will say is I've absorbed it very thoroughly. But I think in this field, there is one of the things is the sense of elitism that the Gnostics call it being the electoi, that one little group of them had achieved this superior status. And what you were saying about Doug saying, well, the people who were the elite could come to him and pay the money and he would take it from them gladly. That sense of superiority is bred into belonging to any tribe. My tribe is the best tribe. My football team is the best football team. My family is better than your family. And that as people leave, that can really, really slow down the process of healing. That the great lesson is humility, to realize, yes, I can be conned. Yes, Bob Cialdini starts his book by saying that the reason he studied influence is because he's a patsy, because anybody can sell him anything. I'm sad to say I'm not sure that's changed in all these years. For me, it hasn't. I understand that I like people. I want to believe them. I want to trust them. And so I don't sign any contracts. Don't join any groups. And I don't have any money, so I don't have anything to worry about, really.
And yet you probably have enough money if there's a little boy on the street or a little girl who is selling candy bars for their special dance performance. I have a feeling you might slip them a pound or two.
Well,
no?
Probably a little boy or girl.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Because we had a flush about 20 years ago of Eastern European beggars coming through, and we found out how professional they were about it. But yeah, if I see somebody homeless with their dog sat on the street, I'll give them a quid. That's absolutely so. And and I'll also give them a kind word, which I think is more important, frankly. And tell them that they're a worthwhile human being in some way or other. But because I can't afford to buy a car, I don't have to worry about secondhand car salesmen and things like that. Let me dig into your book and find something else to challenge you about. At this point.
Okay, sounds good. Please.
Yeah, we had the animus. We also, I note, have the inner child. John Bradshaw's wonderful concoction of this little being inside us that has failed to grow up, which I think probably comes from transactional analysis. I sat with an analyst and many years ago, and I said to her, somebody was doing TA, I said, so it's a form of hypnosis. And she was furious with me. How dare I suggest it was a form of hypnosis? I said, look, so you get somewhere between 3 and 9 chairs and get the person to shuffle between them. They're each of these separate selves that you are creating. You're guiding their imagination. This is, I'm not complaining about hypnosis. It's not something I do to people. I try to avoid it because it can be a bit dangerous, but I understand it can have therapeutic uses. And about 2 weeks later, she'd been to a conference and she called me up and she said, you're absolutely right. It's a way of, and all of these,
cultivating, it's kind of like a way of cultivating a trance state is one way that I think about it.
Or an altered state of consciousness, let's call it that, a different state of consciousness.
Yes.
Because trance now, like the word hypnosis, it has so much trailing behind it. Everybody knows what you mean when you say hypnosis. No, they don't. And because they know what you mean, they don't have to listen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I tend to talk about guided imagination, which is a full definition of hypnosis.
Right.
It's in the Oxford Handbook, the Oxford University Handbook, because people can accept that and think about it and go, oh yeah, he did tell me to visualize this thing, or to, you know.
And that's what we would do. I mean, the way that Doug's work worked was that we would bring our dreams to him, and he would wave his magic wand and bring together these different ideas, and it would be this compelling, emotionally charged experience, and great introspection. You know, some of it, as I said earlier, which did have some helpfulness to it. But we then were asked, we were sent off after our session. At the last like 5 minutes or more were all about articulating our homework. And our homework was exactly what you're talking about, where we were instructed to take the images from the dream that had passed through Doug's magic wand, and we had to conjure them up on an hourly basis. And then that grew into like literally something that we would do many times an hour, to the point that, so here we were like cutting off true imagination, you know, like how one might go through the world and see a tree and make some kind of, you know, beautiful association that might lead to a poem or something.
Or forget-me-nots in both your case and mine. Yeah.
Exactly, or forget-me-nots, exactly. You know, where instead I was inserting this image into my daily life again and again and again. And it makes me want to share one thing that was just horrible that I learned recently from my daughter, who, as you know, grew up through I was in the whole 18 years of her first 18 years of her life. And she remembers we were driving together somewhere. And so here she's now like an adolescent. And, you know, you can think of this time, a mother-daughter driving in a car somewhere together. It can be an opportunity for really connecting, particularly with an adolescent or a teenager, you know, just a time to kind of check in. But her memory, which she just recently shared this with me, was that I had my phone on a 5-minute timer, so that every 5 minutes I would do my homework. So I was interrupted, whatever possible flow of communication or taking in the world around us as we drive through the beautiful countryside or down the city street, whatever it was all gone, because I had this reminder, oh, this was more important to me. And, you know, that was definitely towards the end of my time, but oh, dear Lord, what?
Yes, I mean, imagination. I keep repeating this. I've never read it in the original, but apparently Immanuel Kant said that there is the world outside and there is the world as we each perceive it. Korzybski would later say the map is not the territory. And we live in the map that we've made. We live in our interpretation of the world. Yeah. And that can be far distant from what's actually happening in the world, or it can be useful to us because our mind is predictive and we're trying to work out what's going to happen next so that we can, you know, avoid the danger and get the pleasure. But that we can, therefore, if the imagination is what you own, then it's the richest thing you have. All of our creativity is imagination. When the imagination is given to somebody else, when they've taken it over, it's okay to watch a film or read a book and occasionally lend your imagination to other people. But what happens is the imagination is completely taken over. And so, the control of time and environment, when my great friend Steve Hassan talks about control of behavior, information, thought, and emotion, I kind of go, and the TE you could add to that is time and environment. You have no time to do anything, and you're in an environment, a milieu that is controlled by others. One of the thoughts that was injected, which I made a note of here, is altruism is just another version of arrogance, Doug says. And it was just a lovely little, there are all these horrible little truisms. It takes two to tango. No, it doesn't. You can do it on your own, and people certainly start wars without any help. But all of these little truisms, and the idea that altruism, that wanting to do something to help other people, is arrogance. That is a horrible reflection on this man.
And do you know what's so interesting is that like arrogance was, when I was in the group, I was taught literally in every session and at every retreat that I am an extraordinarily arrogant human being. And it is just like unbelievable to me. Like once I, kind of snapped out of that mind frame that I was in for so many years, I started thinking, like, am I arrogant? Like, what is you? Like, what is it really? And I mean, sure, I can be, there certainly are things that I might have some natural pride about and stuff.
Pride is a different thing from arrogance, though, isn't it? And pride's a good thing, to be proud of what you can do, but not to be shouting about it and bullying people with it, as Doug did.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. It's like that he was laying his persona, onto me. And it's like, that's not mine, it is just not mine to wear. So such a really interesting thing that with enough repetition, you really can, I experienced that how much Doug's repetition, suppressed, who I truly am. And I took on his mantle. And I love what you were saying earlier about the imagination and creativity. I have such profound respect for the work of Robert J. Lifton, and a recent book of his, The Losing Reality,
which sums up his earlier work,
in such a beautiful way. That really the way that we have through and this is not only those of us who have been impacted by cultic environments or human predators, all of us, human beings in general, will come to our highest evolution or capacity when we're really engaging what he calls the protean self, which is really the creative self.
Which he takes from Erickson, who is his mentor.
Right.
No. But yes, I mean, Lifton is in my pantheon. He's quite a remarkable man. And in my own book, Opening Our Minds, my friend Alex Stein, when I was working on it, said, why have you got 2 chapters where you go through the 8 deadly sins of thought reform? And it was like, well, because in the first one, it's the usual approach that's used in the countercult world, which is these things are done to you. You will be given a loaded language. You will enter the cult of confession. There'll be a demand for purity. The next chapter is to say these are things that we do to ourselves in normal life anyway. So that tendency is then amplified within a group. So, do I have a demand for purity? Yeah, of course I do. I want to eat the best possible food.
Right, exactly.
Listen to the best music, and enjoy myself thoroughly, which I do actually. That's one of the things that doesn't happen all that much
Don't we get to celebrate that, John? We get to enjoy ourselves. You know, my husband now makes wine and hard cider, and you know, and he has so much fun doing it. He makes far more. Neither of us drink much.
Yeah.
But for the joy of it and for the joy of sharing it, and we didn't drink at all when we were in the group. And it's not that there was even, it was never said that we shouldn't drink. But when I look around at everybody who was in the group, anybody who did drink at all hid it. Yeah. It was just this unspoken rule, which is part of an everyday cult, is there's many more unspoken rules than spoken, but they speak just as loudly, don't they?
They do. You have to live a certain way. There's an organization called Scientology, Ex-Scientology Kids. They have their own website, and they tend to be adults. You know, they're not actually, it's not little kindergarten, but so there are people indeed in their 60s who as children grew up in this thing. And somebody there noticed something I'd said in a talk about the amount of put downs that are cliches within a group, and they staggered me. They asked their members to make contributions. They got to something like 400 cliches, like make it go right, and you're a downstat, you're a degraded being, all of this stuff. There's children, of course, that had all of these, which create what becomes a tacit agreement to behave in a certain way. And in Scientology, your emotional mood is meant to be enthusiasm. You're meant to be enthusiastic about things, and it leads to such self-separation, such deception, where people have to be putting on this front, as my old friend Jerry Armstrong said of his, you know, I was never an inner member. I didn't suffer total immersion, as it's called. Yanya and various Alex Stein call it total immersion, because I was never a living member. And your experience, you know, similarly.
Yes.
But for people who've had their lives completely controlled, they're down to the 30 seconds they were allowed in the cold shower, they give over so much of themselves to this set of rules. And as Jerry said to me, and this when I first met him in 1984, he said the tone level, because emotional tone is considered very important in Scientology, the tone level of Scientologists working around Hubbard is fear. That all of this, like, yeah, we're going to become these wonderful, exuberant people. So, yeah, my epitaph will be celebrate. You know, that, you know, and, you know, I think it's important not to harm other people, but
we get to have fun. We get to engage in relationships that give us pleasure, you know. Like I remember while I was in the group, my childhood best friend invited me down to a girls' weekend at her little, you know, her place down at the shore by the ocean. And I had so much fun, but I actually had to like separate from the group sometimes, because I thought that, oh no, I'm losing the thread of my work. What is my homework? I can't remember. So I would kind of go off, I would disappear at certain points. And she talks about this now, like, yeah, you know, you go take a half-hour-long shower or go wander off, you know, away from us, or stand in the water, you know, with the waves, where I was trying to regain my thread of my work, because I felt disoriented by just having a bloody good time, you know. And it was so fun, and what a relief it is now to be part of those girls' weekends and truly let it rip and just have a good time. But learning to have a good time is definitely part of the post-cult world. That is an important lesson.
Yes, it
is.
there was a piece in New Scientist this week where they were advocating silliness.
Really?
And saying that this is tremendously good for our mental health. So,
in New Scientist, I have to look that up. Yeah. Okay, I'm writing that one down. Thank you.
I mean, there are also fans of mindfulness, which I'm not keen on. So let's not get into the cult of New Scientist.
Yeah, too many potential traps there.
One of the essential ideas that the man we are calling Doug put forward is I have it here. Homework and ongoing guidance from Doug are our only defense against our pathology. Would you like to explain what this misdefinition of pathology means in that group?
You would have to ask that, John.
Yeah, I would.
Do you know that, well, as I mentioned earlier, I don't, Doug is not his real name. All of the names in the book have changed, everything, completely. And I tried and tried and tried to find a different word than pathology. That is the one word that could someday get me into trouble. The way that it was used in the work, we called it the work, like many other groups do.
Gurdjieff and co.
Yes. It was described to me from my very first session as pathology is what is the part of you that gets in the way of you achieving your highest self. And so what the work was all about was learning to understand the parts of you that truly were in alignment with your trajectory, to be fully unified with God, with the divine, and to identify in no uncertain terms what your pathology is. So as I mentioned earlier, arrogance was a pathology that was laid on me. So in a dream where I think I know something, for example, that a man in the dream is someone who is not trustworthy, I was actually taught in that session that thinking I know that this man is not trustworthy is my arrogance, therefore my pathology. And what I really needed to do was to open my heart fully to this man who, in real life, I learned, I did not know at the time of the dream and at the time of the session with Doug, I learned truly was an abuser. Yeah. My instinct about this man was spot on accurate, but my therapist, beloved analyst Doug, taught me to reverse that so that I was diminishing my instinct, believing that that was arrogance, that was pathology, and, revering this guy instead. So my homework was to be with that man from a place of openness.
So the thing is to erode your own trust. It's also worth saying, I believe it's true that Doug had no qualifications whatsoever to be doing this.
Nada.
Road.
No, he was a civil servant. He had no training. He probably read a few books.
Oh, we've all done that.
Let that be a red flag, number one. And of course, there are plenty of, people who do have training that can also be predators. So, but that is a basic, one.
Yeah. Does somebody have a qualification? Do they? I have to exempt myself. I'm what's called a practitioner scholar, and that's now accepted. I've actually got a chapter coming out in an Oxford University Press book with Steve Hassan that a month or so.
Oh,
and where they call me a practitioner scholar, which is a way of saying a completely unqualified person. So do be careful, anybody that's watching this, don't listen to me. You have to determine whether somebody has the authority to say what they're saying. And I had a recent example. I'm putting together a thing for, hopefully as a curriculum for schools here, and about fake news. And there was a wonderful example. I did some interviews with a man called Andy Nolch, who's quite exceptional. It's on my channel. Okay. And he ended up debunking me in a video, and I ended up taking the transcript of his debunking and his various conspiracy theories. But I wrote him, and he'd said that there are now places where the COVID-19 vaccine is being enforced. And I said, could you name one of these countries? And he sent me back a link to a video. There was a guy standing up at a school board meeting. It had already had 2 million hits by this time, and saying, I'm an Oxford PhD, and I can tell you that within 3 to 5 years of having the vaccine, you will be sterile or dead. And I did a little bit of research on this, and Oxford University in the UK doesn't actually issue PhDs. That's the first red flag. Oh. And the Oxford he'd gone to is in Ohio. And his PhD was not in virology or epidemiology, or indeed any medical subject. It was in education. And the work he was referring to was a single paper which had been withdrawn because it was found that it was written by a disgruntled ex-employee of a pharmaceutical company who had invented references. So what is the authority of a person? Right. What is the source of information? Right. Do they have the right to be doing this? And what do other people say? I mean, the thing I learned on leaving Scientology, they've got all this stuff, Adele Davis, all of this absolute con artist stuff. She was finally sued and stopped, but she'd write these books, Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit, things like this. She'd have a huge list of references in them. And you find out that she actually just employed people to find every reference on a subject and just list it. She didn't read any of them. And her diets were potentially lethal. So when I left Scientology, I went looking and I said, what is the standard view of nutrition? So I found a professor of nutrition from a London university, a guy called Bender, and read his book. And I found out things like, in Scientology, you'll take huge amounts of vitamin C, for example. And he explained that any water-based vitamin, your body will just reject it. So what you should do is actually have a urine test to see how much vitamin C is in your urine. And that'll tell you how much excess you're taking. Worse yet, if you stop taking the vitamin supplement, your body will still be trying to get rid of the stuff, and you'll get you might get scurvy as a result. So it is very important to check the authority and what sense something makes. I just have one more thing, because I see you looking at the clock there, and I wouldn't blame you, frankly.
Oh, I could talk to you forever.
Oh, excellent. Let's do that. We'll make this a completely endless video.
It'd be an endless video.
Good. In that case, the next point that I have tagged is a chapter called Strangled. So would you like to tell our audience about this horrific incident that occurred to you while in the group?
Yeah. So in that, this was in the kind of my last 5 or 7 years in the group. And so at that point, I was very indoctrinated. I was very much, I was in deep. Mm. And I was at a retreat, and one of the things that happens is you have to orient your, or you have to prepare your group for Doug, who comes around to the small groups and then works just the dreams. So, I'm talking to my group about, what my work is at this point. And I keep using air quotes on work.
It's fair enough.
Just in case someone's listening and not watching. And so in this strangled scene, when Doug came to the small group that I was in, he basically deemed that everything that I said was, is it okay to swear or should I not?
Go ahead.
I mean, I can also just say BS. Let's just say it was complete BS. And he was so frustrated with me trying to teach me how untrustworthy my speaking was. And he came up with an idea. And that was to have another one of my group members who happened to be a football player, like was a serious not quarterback, but what are the ones in defense? This is not, this is
American
US
football.
American football.
Big people.
Really big, this is a 6'5" person who's got shoulders, twice the width of mine. And in fact, a very beautiful, kind-hearted person who was very big. And so he called him over and said, you get to strangle her. And so literally he has this guy, put his hands around my throat and looks at him very intently and says, every time she talks and is speaking BS, you put your hands, don't press. And he was like, you don't need to use pressure, just put the hands there. That's all that's needed. So that was special treatment.
In front of the whole group.
This is not only in front of the whole group, we also, that was the small group, but then that continued when we go back into the whole group retreat. So there's the small groups of 8 or 10 people. We all come together, 70 to 100 people in a retreat. And it also happened there too. And that unfortunately did not wake me up. That was, I certainly describe in that chapter of my book, what happened to me. There was, certainly it was an experience of disassociation, because it was extremely disorienting and humiliating and extraordinarily confusing, because the truth is, I didn't understand it. He was giving me a treatment, he, meaning Doug, excuse me, was giving me special treatment to have this guy, put his hands around my throat. Isn't that weird to say that was special treatment? But that's how it was treated. If you had someone, there might be only people who were really ready to be pushed, to break through their stubborn pathology, would be given an intervention like that. So this was actually, we talked earlier about, being elite or esteemed. It was actually kind of a coveted position.
And a way of trauma bonding.
And absolutely a way of trauma bonding.
Yeah, I'm fairly outspoken against Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
I learned meditation as an 18-year-old in a Zen monastery. The Zazen practice, which has now become mindfulness meditation. And of course, there are many savage stories within Zen of, people having bits of them cut off, or, this privileged position. When the Bodhidharma took the Chan or Zen teaching, Dhyana teaching to China in around about 500 AD, it said he wouldn't teach anybody. And eventually this man waits outside in the snow and severs his own arm and sends it in and says, that's how determined I am to be with you. So there's this line of teaching, and which unfortunately the Zen masters taught the Japanese military from the 1890s right through the Second War to be completely heartless. And when you look at the statistics of deaths of prisoners of war, the Japanese, just horrendous, because they had bought into a belief system that was about their purity, the golden people idea, the idea that the emperor was the new Buddha, in fact, greater than the Buddha. They were part of his family. This whole cult doctrine, which was then exported to the West through Alan Watts and Daisetsu Suzuki, who was in fact one of the most significant demagogues of the Zen movement in the 30s, telling people how the Chinese needed true Buddhism by having swathes of them murdered at Nanjing and what have you. So these kind of cultic thoughts, that the cultic behaviors that take over society, that's kind of, it's bounced me off. But physical violence has often been an aspect of this, and this idea of showing somebody up, humiliating somebody, so that you're caught in this bind where you're saying, I'm being given preferential special treatment on the one hand, and I am being abased and humiliated on the other.
At exactly the same time.
Which leads to more willingness to be controlled, the double bind.
Yes.
That confusion is the basis of so much hypnotic leading with people. You confuse somebody, then you can direct them.
Exactly. And that is, John, exactly what happened, because I would always schedule an extra session right after a retreat, because I always needed some extra help, and so more money in Doug's pocket, less in mine. And but I went into that first session after that retreat and said, Doug, I am really confused. I don't understand this. Help me understand it. And what happened is I gradually understood what he was thinking, what he was trying to reinforce to others. And that was something that I had to reiterate every single retreat. And I would go to retreats, 3 to 6 times a year. Sometimes we started doing some smaller retreats and stuff, but towards the end, that's what I was doing. And every retreat, I would describe to my retreat group that treatment and how important it was for me to realize that if I did not have that treatment, I would have been speaking BS most of the time. And here we are. Isn't that all we're doing today, John? Just talking.
Yeah, we should be doing something important instead.
We should be doing really important work, shouldn't we?
Let me pick up one other point.
So, and I will say it that I actually, I do have another appointment in just about 20 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So probably 10 minutes would be the.
So when you promised me eternity.
I know, I'm just like, I've terrible, just terrible.
I think I only have one significant area to pick on. There is so much in this book that is really fine. Let me say again, it's something that anybody can read. You don't. It's not a specialist tome, and it will. I've been around this world. 47 years ago that I got involved in Scientology. So, and I've had a life of studying the history of religion and various other cult groups. And I think this is an important book because it's a way of, it will be useful for anyone, even for somebody like me who is really familiar. It puts things into focus. It explains things, explains material in a straightforward way. Now, you come to this one place.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. Yeah.
My pleasure. One of the essential aspects of Scientology and many other groups is the notion of reincarnation or past lives. We find it in Hinduism and in Buddhism. I went to Scientology from Soto Zen Buddhism, so I already believed in reincarnation, but I didn't believe it in the personalized way that it is believed in Scientology, which is the Hindu Jivatman, the idea that you as an individual persist forever. The Buddhist idea is more, it was explained to me by a Zen teacher, that the body is a light bulb which is illuminated by the electricity that is the life force, but it is not an individual. And of course, the realization of nirvana is that we are none of us individuals. All great fun.
Okay.
As an agnostic, I don't have to believe anything anymore.
Right.
But Hubbard, having founded on trying to get people to achieve this wonderful state of clear where they'd be thoroughly rational and not given to misemotion and have a perfect IQ, which had failed dreadfully after the initial enthusiasm in 1950. He then, of course, had to keep introducing excuses as to why it didn't work. And one of them was the idea introduced very early on in 1951 of past lives. He took that expression from Aleister Crowley. He didn't use reincarnation. He often used Crowleyite terms because that was what he liked. And we have this wonderful passage, and I'm going to make a historian's comment on this as well before we go on, by the way.
Okay, great.
Through a series of dreams, Doug and his paramour Jenny share openly a riveting past life story builds, coinciding with a retreat at a castle in the Alsace region. Through their dreams and instructions from the divine, the couple plumb their emotional and spiritual depths to reveal that they were married in a past life, living as Christian mystics who inspired a devotional community. Together, they lived in transcendent harmony with God and the earth during the 12th century. Now, this is the point where I stop, because the history of the 12th century is a matter of some fascination for me. And while it is true that this is the time of Bernard of Clairvaux, of St. Francis of Assisi, of Abelard and Heloise, and of tremendous movement within the Catholic Church, which dominated, the idea of somebody being able to do this in the 1100s in Alsace is fairly imponderable, so I don't think this is true. Trauma was also woven into the tapestry of their previous life together. Their story becomes increasingly vivid through the dreams they report having in the months leading up to their nuptial vows. They lived in a remote mountainous village until they were persecuted for heresy and witchcraft. Again, I think they've displaced the time, and I think what they want to be talking about is the Albigensians, or the Cathars, who were, of course, in the Languedoc region of France, and who were the first group to be genocidally destroyed by the Catholic Church. But it was in the 13th century, not the 12th century. So just some pedantic points there.
Beautiful correction of the history there. Thank you, John. That's perfect. And it is extraordinary for me to hear you read those words. And I'm like, I'm like, part of me wants to just burst out laughing. Another part of me is like cringing, and another part of me is just like, so like odd, like how, the audacity of this narrative being laid onto, a group of people who, saw them as leaders. Whew, thank you for that. That was a really powerful experience for me. I appreciate it, John.
And here are you being criticized for arrogance by a man who believes that God inspired him to be a great teacher.
Exactly.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. How powerful was the idea of past lives in the group?
It became a very strong theme. And it was around that time, actually, that my husband started drifting away from the group. It was just a bit too much for him. At that time, too, he was also in training to be a licensed clinical mental health counselor, which he is today. So that was also part of it. that he's kind of looking at what we're doing, saying, eek. At the same time, he was looking at what his wife was doing and saying, oh, if I push her too hard, she's going to leave. And he was right. If he did not push me during those last few years. But the past life theme was quite galvanizing. So here we were, like, already immersed in this constructed narrative around our dreams. And by constructed, I mean, what Doug constructed from, my individual dreams and each one of us. So when we layered on the past life, the grip was pretty big for those who were already bought in. It would be interesting to speak to some people who have left. I've never thought about this, John. I think you're bringing out a good point. This may have been a point of departure for some others who had left. I could do a little research on that.
In Scientology, one of the early devotees was the great science fiction writer A.E. Van Vogt. And very sadly, when he started practicing Dianetics with Hubbard, he stopped writing fiction. I was in touch with him 34 years later, and he was still practicing a form of Dianetics, but he broke with Hubbard over the idea of past lives or spirits or any of that. He believed that, very interesting man.
Very interesting.
But
and still no longer writing.
I think he's no longer breathing by now.
Okay.
But,
okay.
very old indeed.
Yes.
Who knows? I haven't been in touch with him for almost.
Okay.
But you're a great writer, a really imaginative writer. And so, it just so happens that I didn't know he'd been involved. And as a Scientologist, I read a lot of his stories and, was very interested in that. So it was incredible to actually be able to have a correspondence with this man later on, who still absolutely believed in the early form of Hubbard's teaching, which I don't. So there you go. But
for the record,
I'm sorry.
I said for the record.
For the record, yes, that's absolutely clear.
Yes.
What interests me is, having talked with sort of well over 1,000 Scientologists, I've never heard a credible account of past life experience. Curiously, it seems to me that Doug may have read a particular book. May have.
Oh, what book is that?
It's a book by a psychiatrist called Arthur Gurdam, Guirdham. We'll put a link in. I've mentioned this before, called We Are One Another. And Gurdam was a psychiatrist in Bristol, in England, an atheist, not a believer in anything supernatural. And he had a client who said that she had been tortured in a past life, and she had marks on her back from this. And he thought, yeah, well, so what? Mad woman, what have you. He was a psychiatrist working as a psychotherapist. Then somebody else came along who didn't know this woman, who had a similar story. And they were talking about the early 13th century in the south of France, in what was then not part of France, the Languedoc, the place where they say "oc" instead of "oui." And under Raymond, the Count of Toulouse, and the complete genocide of these people, the Albigenses or Cathars, because they splintered from the Catholic Church. They allowed women to be priests. Can you imagine it? Their priests had to be pure. And the Catholic Donatist tradition, it doesn't matter whether the priest is pure, the sacrament will be pure. For their parfaits, their perfects, as they called their priests, you had to live a good and moral life. And that was that. Ridiculous ideas, totally incompatible with true religion. In this book, he basically went to the Languedoc, he talked with somebody who was opening records that had never been opened before, and he found the names of people that had been given to him. Now, I still don't accept this as any proof of reincarnation. I did when I was a Scientologist. It's the closest I've ever seen.
Interesting.
the many things I've looked at. But the idea was a group of people who will be born in a particular place, who are followers of a Christian mystic. You know, there's a certain resonance that I'm picking up.
Exactly. So interesting. I will take, boy, I would love to, I still would love to have a conversation with Doug. And if that ever were to happen, I would love to ask him if he has read We Are One Another.
Yes.
Okay. I'll report back to you, John.
Yeah. If and when he ever calls you up on the phone.
Yes. If and when.
And I think probably a final point, I've only got a few tags left. One of the things that got me out of Scientology was finding out that Ron Hubbard used to scream his head off at people. And I just have this thing that for me, a totally cool Buddha type person would never do that. They would never sink to that. They'd be able to smile at you until you got it worked out. And so when I found that out, because I'd never left my beliefs in Buddhism and indeed in Lao Tzu and Zhangzi, the founders of Taoist, 3 people who founded religions who were all atheists. Isn't that fascinating? It's like, oh, none of them believed in supernatural things. But I still had that going in my head. And so when I found that Hubbard had done what he called a severe reality adjustment, where you get 2 inches away from somebody, this is a man whose teeth rotted in his head, so it must have really been horrible fug around there. He would scream and spit at you, telling you the most deplorable person in the universe.
Yeah.
And break you. Somebody, a good friend put it to me that Hubbard was sometimes compassionate. And having spent so many years, 38 years, I don't spend my time studying Scientology anymore. It's a long time ago. I did way too much of it. But I said, so the story you're going to tell me is he came up to somebody after he'd shouted at them an hour or 2 later, and he said, "Are you still mad at me?" The guy looked at me and went, "How did you know that?" Because that's what he always did. You know, that's the way. So this thing about the rage that was experienced by Doug, it is another.
Exactly. That was the way that Doug would yell at people, and I had witnessed it many times. He had yelled at me many times. But, you know, for me, it was really interesting that it was hearing a beloved teacher, you know, a beloved leader in the group, who was someone who was a very gentle-hearted poet, sensitive person. When she described that Doug would yell at her, that's when that is actually when my mind finally opened. Not before that.
Yeah.
You know, that pedestal that I put Doug on, he didn't deserve it. Because to yell at Kaylee was not okay. There was no way that would ever be acceptable. He could yell at someone like me, I'm thick-headed or whatever, you know, that's what I thought.
Thick-skinned, perhaps.
Thick-skinned, but yeah. So yes, that yelling is, you know, that verbal abuse is a very real thing. It's very real.
I see it and always have done. I mean, as a small child, I would leave the room if anybody raised their voice. I was terrified of that. And I never saw the point of it. And it has come, you know, when I went to school, they were still allowed to hit us. And I now
get whacked by a ruler. By the
I was caned. I was given 6 of the best when I was at a posh grammar school, which I walked out of when I was 14, but that's another story altogether.
Okay, we'll have to save that.
But that whole thing for me, shouting at people, that authoritarian attitude, it's very much like corporal punishment. It's a form of inducing trauma and making abuse. And Doug, as with Ron Hubbard, as with so many of these people, what they're telling us is they're going to relieve the abuse, the trauma that we've suffered so that we can be free. And they then actually do the opposite. So great. Well, it's been a great pleasure talking with you, and we'll do it again one day.
Absolutely. I hope so, John. I really, really appreciate the conversation and your observations. It's just a total delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And rush out and buy Gerette's book and read it straight away, and write nice reviews on Barnes and Noble and Waterstones and Amazon and wherever else. And thank everybody for spending time with us. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all. So appreciate it. I welcome comments.
Yes, absolutely. Questions, comments. We will welcome them. And if we can get together and answer questions later on, maybe that give us
for sure. And I would also say, I hope that people will be inspired to check out igotOut.org as well.
And there will be links in the description below.
Oh, perfect.
Great.
Thanks so much, John. Have a beautiful day.
You too.
Bye-bye now.
And
hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.